I need someone to show me my place in all this.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you?
I'm no one. There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
May the Force be with us.
My nerd world.
Just let it in.
Ojaba. Why does she get a blaster and I don't? Ojaba.
All right, we'll go ahead and we'll make this episode number 104 of the My Nerd World Star Wars podcast. I'm your host, Jon Justice, and I'm about an hour or so removed from seeing The Last Jedi for a third time in as many days. I love this movie. I absolutely love this movie. And I actually found the third time watching it to be more emotional on different levels, but more emotional as the first time I saw it. These movies are so hard to digest as a fan. So, and let me put this up front. There's a couple things I want to put out there up front as we go through the podcast, and I give you my spoiler-filled, I want to say, review, and I went down and sort of laid out the movie on paper in front of me and was considering kind of going scene by scene. I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm going to try to cover the movie in order, but really zero in on the things that impacted me most without having to break down every single item in the movie. I mean, if I was going to do that, it would probably take me 2.5 hours to do that. And I'd much rather focus on the things that really mean the most to me. Raylo. And if I happen to miss anything, I miss something, and I can always cover it in the upcoming podcasts. But let me say a couple of things up front before we move forward with this. Watching a Star Wars film is a completely unique and different experience for me, and I think for a lot of people, than watching any other movie. The only other franchise or stories that I could possibly look at are, say, like Harry Potter when it comes to mythology, or maybe even Lord of the Rings. But the difference in those films is that they were based on books, and books where you had a source that you could go to. And I imagine reading when, say, Lord of the Rings originally came out. Obviously, that's a tough one because it was a much different time, and you didn't have the opportunity to discuss it on Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit, and everywhere else. Harry Potter, I suppose, is a better example, and people lining up to go to the bookstore when a new book would go and come out to find out what was going to happen. So when it comes to Star Wars, and maybe for some comic book fans, it's like this for them, but there's a deep-rooted mythology. And I remember watching the movie today and thinking to myself, and I want to make sure that I clarify this, thinking to myself that that Star Wars is life, okay? But I only mean Star Wars is life from the perspective of it's not all of life, but it's a part of our lives, and it's a part of my life. It's certainly not the most important part of my life, but it is a big part of my life. And it's really funny because I was at work on Friday after having seen the movie Thursday night, and I got to work early like I always do, and I had put everything aside Star Wars related and was just focused on the work that I was doing. I wasn't even listening to review podcasts. I woke up in the morning and did a little bit of listening to podcasts while I worked, but I could have. I usually walk around the station as I go about my business before the show starts, and I listen to music. And I could have very easily gone and listened to a bunch of podcasts, and I didn't, because I know the importance of making sure that I put aside the other things in life to focus on the job that I have to do. And because that's what an adult is supposed to do, right? Even though I could have easily have spent 3 hours of the show just talking about Star Wars, and that would have been very, very reckless of me and irresponsible. But it was funny. The guy that I do the show with came in. He's like, "Are you going to be able to handle it? Have you been able to get any work done in this post-Star Wars glow?" And he was kidding. I think it was just because my fandom was so big that there was a level of almost seriousness that I think he maybe felt that I wasn't going to be able to differentiate between the two. But it got me on this thinking of, Star Wars is life, and we wear our Star Wars, and I've been wearing my Star Wars. You can see it on the t-shirts that I wear. So watching a Star Wars film, because I want to get to the movie, but watching a Star Wars movie is a completely different experience for so many of us. And it's clear, listening to a lot of different shows and a lot of different fans like me, that first experience of watching a new Star Wars movie is one that, you have to watch these movies a few times to really absorb them, because there's so much care being put into the material and we care so much about it. Okay, so you can't, at least in my opinion, look at a Star Wars movie like you would any other film that you go and see. You can have a great time going and watching Thor Ragnarok or Justice League, and maybe you'll talk about it afterwards, but there's very little, times when I'm going, I've got to go back and see that in the theater again because it gripped me so much. That's what Star Wars does for me, and that's what this movie did for me. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is, this movie has obviously been incredibly divisive with the fandom. If you have been on YouTube at all, there's all these videos, this movie sucks, and the different ratings on different websites that put together their percentages of how well the movie's doing. The critics overwhelmingly liked it, but the fans seem really split, and there's certainly a lot more negativity right up front for this movie than there was for The Force Awakens. I don't care. I love this movie. But let me say this. This is what happens and what needs to happen, in my opinion, for this franchise to remain alive and to grow. Because this movie takes a bunch of risks. And because it takes a bunch of risks, for people that care about this franchise, you are going to run the risk of taking risks that other people didn't like. It's like Rian Johnson goes and takes a bunch of risks in this movie, and let's point specifically to Rey and Kylo. And I think a lot of this is falling down the Rey and Kylo Reylo backlash, because for those of us that were on board with Reylo, and I certainly got on that bandwagon late in, it took me about a year after The Force Awakens and only this past year to really start leaning more towards Reylo and my desire to see that some type of Reylo and Kylo come together. This movie was a dream come true in what they did, but in the fandom, a lot of people had a hard time with that Reylo and mocked the people who were in support of Reylo. So because Rian Johnson went that direction with the film, I think you're also seeing this split in the fandom. And when you have a movie, again, that takes risks, but they're not the risks that other people would have liked you to take, then ultimately you're going to end up upsetting a bunch of individuals. On a third viewing of this movie, I don't have any problems with it. I don't. When I walked out of it the first time, there were some things flying, and again, this is the spoiler podcast, flying Leia, I was a little bit hesitant on, although when I watched it in the theater the first time, it didn't take me out of the movie, but I was still a bit kind of wishy-washy on it. Watching the first time and seeing the Force phone calls, I'm calling them Force calls, but seeing the connection between and those scenes between Kylo and Rey, while I loved them and was really happy to get the explanation from Snoke that he was the one who was doing it. When I watched it originally, the first time seeing it, it was a bit jarring. The end of the movie, when Luke Skywalker is, unbeknownst to me watching it the first time, looks a little different has a haircut, beard is darker, and is using the legacy lightsaber that just got destroyed on the Supremacy was really, really throwing me off, to the point where when everything played out upon first viewing, the impact of what Luke had done and how amazing that was didn't quite hit me. It wasn't until the second viewing, and honestly, I teared up at the end of the third viewing of this movie at the passing of Luke Skywalker more than I did the first time, and certainly the second time. I teared up more during the third viewing of the scenes with Rey and Kylo and the conflict, and how heartbroken Rey must have been in that moment where she thought that she had done what she wanted to do. She thought that she had won that battle, had brought Kylo back after that fight with the Praetorian Guards. She could save the Resistance. She could save her friends, only to see Kylo just do what so many people do, and that is fail in that moment when you have a choice to make. And knowing what was going to happen and her not choosing to go down that path with him. And I'll be honest, when I saw the movie the first time, there was a part of me, just from a pure story standpoint, that wanted Rey to join Kylo because that would have been a fascinating thing to dissect. But at the same time, that's not what happened. And life doesn't often happen the way that you want it to happen. And certainly when it comes to the story, I think it serves it better than to go into 9 with this power duo and no other individual who we really have seen in the films be able to be the ones to bring them both back. This was the way that it had to go. But this is a beautifully shot movie. I'm hesitant to say at this point if it's my favorite right now, except I will say this, and maybe this is the way that we need to start looking at these films, and maybe this new sequel trilogy moving forward. These movies are kind of like my children. I love them all. I love them both for the same reason and for different reasons, and I love them equally. And I will watch them, not my children, these movies, at various times for various reasons. And maybe it's better to look, now that we're 9 total Star Wars movies in, maybe it's time for the fandom to stop ranking these and putting so much importance on it and just go, did you love it? Yeah, I loved it. And there's nothing wrong with ranking them. There's nothing wrong with putting the list together. A lot of it comes down to individuals, wanting to be a part of it and wanting to see where everybody else's lists line up compared to somebody else's. And I get all that, but maybe it's time to put that away and just start looking at it, unless it's just a bad movie, as, no, we just love them for different reasons. And so at this point in time, I love The Force Awakens and I love The Last Jedi for different reasons, and I love them both almost equally. What I'm most excited about upon these films and what The Last Jedi did was, it no longer feels like we're at least for me, like watching a sequel trilogy. I now feel like we're watching this saga play out. This movie had so much depth and was so different and expanded the mythology so much that it really, I can't wait for 9 to see what J.J. Abrams does, but I also am thinking, man, I get to live with The Last Jedi and Force Awakens now for 2 years while these creative minds produce and make the final tale in the story. And knowing that that's out there, I'm totally fine with waiting. And knowing that we've got a Han Solo movie coming up in 5 months, that'll give us something else to go and talk about. All right, so I've spent 15 minutes without talking about the movie. Let's get into it. And again, I've got my list here. I'm just going to work through, and we'll see how far I get in the time that I permit myself for the podcast. And whatever I don't get to this week, I'm sure that we'll go and we'll cover again in next week's episode. So let's just go ahead and start. We'll start at the beginning of the movie, and I'll start working through and giving you my thoughts.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
The opening of The Last Jedi is, I will say this though, because there are moments in this film that rival anything I've ever seen in a Star Wars movie before. The whole opening sequence of The Last Jedi is hands down my favorite opening sequence of any of the movies at all. And I like the opening sequences of all the films, but if you were to say which one is your favorite, it's The Last Jedi. From the crawl to the usage of the opening notes of A New Hope, which I thought was just amazing, because that instantly brings a dee-doo, ba-doo-doo-doo-doo. When I heard it the first time, I went, oh my gosh, that's The New Hope. And it makes sense, though, right? When you think about it, because this is about Rey and her journey and her becoming the New Hope. So it makes sense that if that's the reason why John Williams did it, it makes sense that he would open up this movie using those opening notes from A New Hope. But the getting to the surface of Dakar instantly, seeing the evacuation, the way that the evacuation was shot, seeing the shuttles leave the surface and coming up to the screen, the pan down. You know, we drop down from space, and then we do this flyby past the Resistance escape ships and the Raddus, waiting for the people to come off the surface, evacuating, picking up right where The Force Awakens left off, seeing the Star Destroyers come flying, into frame from the surface of the planet's point of view, and then right to that shot from the trailer that I loved, that I talked about last week, where it's Poe Dameron squaring off against the Dreadnought, and that whole opening sequence was just amazing. And upon all three viewings, it has not lost a single bit of luster and excitement for me. All of it. The tension of Paige and what happened there, the heartbreak of seeing the Resistance bombers get blown up, and her grabbing the remote to drop them, and then the Dreadnought exploding, and just that massive explosion, to the comedy between Hux and Poe, which again, echoes the beginning of The Force Awakens, and the who talks first, you talk first, I talk first. I just can't tell with all the apparatus. I think for some people it threw off a bit of that scene, but again, be reminded that with The Force Awakens, it was there was the comedy bit at the beginning of that movie, and I love the comedy throughout this movie. So hands down, that opening scene of The Last Jedi was just amazing. And then of course, we head directly to Ahch-To, and there's been quite a bit of discussion of that first meeting that we've been waiting to see between Luke and Rey. I'll say this about it. It doesn't bother me. I'm totally fine with it. I'm not going to say that I like it. It's not something to say that I like. It's just very establishing. That, Rey hands him the saber and he throws it over his shoulder. I had a bit of a chuckle over it. It's not anything that I'm looking forward to when I watch the movie, and all of that is okay for this very reason. All of that is okay because what are you supposed to do with that scene that's not going to go and disappoint somebody? I mean, that's the thing that we've been waiting for. We were left at the end of The Force Awakens with this, question of what happens next in that moment, and based off of how Luke is and his character is, there's no other real way to handle that. I mean, you could have him just drop it and walk away, but that doesn't, but then you've just done that. Okay. You can't have him hand it back and then just, hand it back and walk away. Okay. So, make it a little bit more dynamic and just be like, no, man, and have him throw it over his shoulder. And to me, it really fits in with the scene of seeing his routine on Ahch-To prior to his beginning training Rey. because he's been by himself, and he's going to act a little bit aloof, and he's got a bit of Yoda about him, and he's kind of a curmudgeon, and he's obviously heartbroken knowing what we all know now that happened with the Academy, and has just resigned himself to live out the rest of his life on this island with these porgs and these caretakers, and kind of leaving the rest of the galaxy to go and just fend for themselves. And so, from a story perspective, it all makes sense. And I didn't have a problem with that at all. But again, most of this is coming from where our head was from watching The Force Awakens when we watched those scenes and what's happening. Because, how is any of that supposed to live up to your expectations? The only way it could have is if they completely changed the story. She hands the lightsaber over and she says, "Oh my gosh, daughter, where have you been? I've missed you so much. I must tell you about everything that happened and what happened to your mom." And we go into a hut that's all laid out for us. End credits. But that's not the way that this was going to go. That's not the way that Rian Johnson took it. And it's not the way that Rian Johnson should have taken it. So I like how all of that was established right out the gate. By the way, a quick side note, and I'll try to drop these in as I move along, just the things that I've learned. The door to Luke's hut was the wing of an X-Wing fighter. I don't know if you realize that or not. Yeah, next time you watch the movie, take a look at it. Yeah, it's the wing of an X-Wing. I thought it was cool. Then we get to... I forgot what happens first. Do we get Finn waking up? We get the Finn waking up scene, which I enjoyed. I thought the comedic element of that was good. The exchange between him and Poe. I love Poe Dameron in this movie more so than I did the Force Awakens. And again, the comedy there to me totally worked. Getting way ahead of myself on a third viewing, I actually really do like Rose and Finn and Rose's story, and I do like Canto Bight. And I loved the father scene chase sequence from the start. I don't feel like they dwell too much time there. I think they spend just the amount of time on Canto Bight. The movie is long. Could you have trimmed it up? Yeah, but you couldn't have. That's the only place of the movie I think you could have trimmed it up anymore. Would have been the Canto Bight scenes. But to trim up the Canto Bight scenes anymore would have made that way too jarring. And I think a lot of people are having a hard time with, and this is my own personal opinion. Okay, so I could be completely wrong, but I think a lot of people are having a hard time with the casino sequences and Canto Bight because one, it's the most prequel thing in the movie, and two, we're so captivated with everything else that's happening in the movie. I love the whole dynamic of the First Order chasing down the Resistance, even though I've heard some people nitpick it. I'm not going to. I thought it was a great storyline that kept all of this stuff in play and kept the tension, kept real tension going on, watching the Resistance throughout the movie just get slowly decimated and reduced. And of course, the training of Rey and then the Force calls between Rey and Kylo, those were also good that I think... While we need time to go by and we need this other story element to take place, in the back of people's minds, they're wanting to get back to these other things that they find so exciting. It reminds me a lot of 24. If you watch 24 with Kiefer Sutherland, there was always the running joke that they had to throw in these other storylines to get the clock to have the clock move ahead because it's supposed to be based in real time. So for those that watched 24 and you remember when his daughter and there was the coyote or whatever situation where she was in the mountains that was just utterly ridiculous. So they always had these side stories that they had to use to get to where they needed to go because time had to elapse. That's how I look at Canto Bight, but at the same time, I also really, really enjoy it. So I just, again, getting to Finn waking up and seeing that whole thing. I love Finn's arc. I thought the Phasma battle was great, so I had no problem with that at all. Which brings us to, we'll look at the clock. Okay, we're good. Which brings me to one of my first moments of the movie that ends up being one of my favorite moments in Star Wars, apart from the opening, I guess. So, okay, this is just another one of my favorite moments of the whole movie. When Kylo shows back up and has to face Snoke for the first time. And I thought Snoke was spectacular. I thought the CGI work on him looked great. I thought Andy Serkis' performance was fantastic. And it was so good that I was totally fine with them killing him. Like, they did such a good job with the dialogue and the intensity of Snoke that when they took him out, I was like, I'm fine with it because I got what I wanted. He was terrifying. It gave me a fantastic shock. And now we know now we know where this story is headed. Now this is Rey and Kylo, and how is this whole thing going to play out? And I want to see that more than anything else. So to do the risk of taking away the big bad in Snoke, I was 100% fine with. And the way that they did it was absolute magic, in my opinion. But that first appearance between Snoke and Kylo, which obviously takes place after his defeat, and Snoke's kind of sticking it to him, take that ridiculous mask or helmet off. I mean, just demeaning Kylo in that moment, to the point where Kylo almost attacked him and he nails him with the Force lightning. The scene that I absolutely love, that to me cemented Kylo and where he was at, was when he gets into that elevator. And we saw it in the trailers, but obviously wasn't the whole scene. And he begins violently smashing his helmet against the wall of the elevator. I mean, like, he does it once and it's broken. It's done. And he ain't done, though. He's like, no, this is not destroyed enough. And just keeps beating on it and beating on it. And that, to me, was so agonizing. When you really begin to think about what he was doing, I mean, he wore that mask because he wanted to portray himself as the bad guy. Right, the ultimate bad guy. I mean, Snoke even says it. The heir to Darth Vader. This.
When I found you, I saw raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special.
That whole sequence and him going to break the helmet, to me, was just so awesome. And I love that raw rage of how he must have felt, that this thing that he was using that was like, yeah, man, I'm a bad guy. I'm a bad A with my helmet. And he's so angered that he just destroys. And I was thinking to myself, the only other thing I would have wanted was to seen his hand bleeding after just destroying this piece of him. Then we subsequently get the next scene, which takes place, which is him going, ready my ship. And he goes out in his TIE silencer basically, he's getting out his rage of being humiliated by Snoke and trying to do right by him by attacking the Resistance. And yet in the moment, he still can't kill his mom. And to me, that was the signal where it's like, oh man, this guy has got issues. This guy has got significant problems. And he is conflicted in the most just, conflicting way possible. And that whole sequence of Kylo, like, I was thinking to myself, there's, why don't we have he took out the hangar bay, and it bums me out because Talia and her A-Wing got blown up right away, and I was hoping she'd make it through the rest of the movie because I really liked that A-Wing pilot. But obviously he took out the ship so they weren't able to go and attack, which, puts the Resistance in a position where they can't really go anywhere else because all the fighters have been destroyed. And I was thinking to myself, wow, it would have been nice to see a space battle there. But at the same time, no, it was great just seeing the way that Rian Johnson shot those scenes and the devastation and what he was doing, and then flying into the ship to blow up the hangar. I was like, no, man, there's enough space action here that it's totally not necessary. But in that moment, to see Kylo go in and hesitate and pull his finger off the trigger, only to have his other two special forces pilots go and bomb the hangar anyways, and then suck Leia out of the bridge. And this is where the trailers kind of tell you that she's going to make it, because we know there are shots in the trailers where you see her later on in the movie in other locations. So obviously she can't die. But in the moment, the first time I saw it, I was like, and how are we going to save Leia? And I know so many people had a hard time with it, but after, again, seeing it 3 times, and I didn't have that hard of a time seeing it the first time. John Williams' music in that moment when she force pulls her back to the ship, absolutely makes that scene. And I don't know how else you do that, right? And obviously, at least from my perspective, the filmmakers and Rian Johnson took special care to make it look very specific. But this movie is a movie where we're seeing, force powers the way that we haven't seen before. And the ability to force project or to bring two people together in one location via a projection isn't necessarily something we've seen before, except for in The Force Ghosts, because that's essentially what it is they're doing. They're manifesting themselves in death to a particular location. So the idea would be that they're on another plane and having to go and do that. And in The Force, they can do that. And of course, Luke ends up giving his life because he drains all of his life force to allow them the opportunity to escape, to make sure that Rey and the Resistance are safe to go and battle the First Order and what Ben has become. Luke knew that Rey was going to be the one, and he's heeding Yoda's advice in the movie of, okay, I'm going to pass on what I've learned. I've done some training with Rey. She has, well, he doesn't know she has the books, but we know she has the Jedi books from the temple, from the tree on Ahch-To, and he knows that he has to go and give them a fighting chance. That is how he is going to go and cement himself, his own legacy. And I believe that's probably what we're going to end up seeing in Episode 9, is I'm sure that Luke's going to end up returning as a Force Ghost to, continue Rey on her path, much in the same way that Obi-Wan Kenobi did in Return of the Jedi. So getting back to Leia, seeing her use that power and understanding how strong she is in the Force, which makes all the sense in the world that she would be because she's a Skywalker. For everybody else that had a problem with it, I thought it absolutely worked. It is Star Wars. It's fantasy. We're not looking at the laws of a real world universe. So I was completely and totally fine with that. And again, on subsequent viewings, I actually really do enjoy that scene. It has a very magical quality to it. All right, so then we get back to more of Rey and Luke training. The first time that she trains, when she's out on the rock, and we have that comedic moment where she reaches out with her arm when he says reach out, and she meant, reach out from in here, and he's like, yeah, and he tickles her hand with the leaf. I absolutely loved all of that. And this is where Rian Johnson, to me, deviates a lot from what we've seen in other Star Wars movies, because in that moment where she's coming to grips with the Force and she's meditating on the rock before she splits it, he's, what do you see? And she's going around, I see, light, darkness, cold, warmth, death, decay, and the life that it brings. Those shots were really, really great shots, but it had those quick shots of, the camera panning across a meadow and the sprouts coming up from the soil, it's being sped up. That's imagery that we're not used to seeing in Star Wars movies, and it works. But that, to me, is where this movie differentiates itself from other Star Wars movies. And when people say it's much different than a Star Wars film, to me, it's moments like that, and certainly the moment when she goes into the dark side cave, where we've seen a little bit of that kind of weirdness before in the visions, certainly in the prequel trilogy, never anything that abstract. Like, the most abstract that we got, even close to Rey going underneath the island into the tree and seeing the multiple bodies and the snapping of her fingers, and then seeing herself in the reflection, which I firmly believe was the Force telling her, your parents are of no consequence to you anymore. It's just you now. You need to move forward and past your parents because you don't. They're of no importance. And I do buy that Kylo was right when he said that. I mean, there's a chance that J.J. Abrams could retcon that or say that Kylo was lying, but it was said many times. Maz Kanata said it in The Force Awakens, and now Kylo said it, and then Rey even said it when they all say, you know the truth. You know who they are, right? You already know the truth. And she says, they were nobody. They sold you off for drinking money. They're in a grave on Jakku. I believe that is the case, and I'm glad that we've kind of moved past that. We all, myself included, we all grew that into something much, much bigger than what it ever was between The Last Jedi and but between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, that if we're disappointed in that, we really have ourselves to blame. I did have a bit of an issue with the training part of it, from the standpoint of, I guess, only that I wanted to see more. Only because I wanted to see more of the training. Here's your first lesson. Here's your second lesson. This is a long movie already. We have to get to other fantastic greatness. So, therefore, I understand we're not going to be able to see all aspects of it, and it does mirror the training, doing that thing with my fingers, that Luke Skywalker got in The Empire Strikes Back, obviously, where we didn't see a whole lot except for lifting rocks and then Yoda speaking to him. So, again, watching the film, it was only from a desire of wanting to see more that I felt like there wasn't enough, when in reality there was enough, if that makes sense. And I know I'm a little bit off of the timeline here, but that moment was so great when, at the end of the scene, when Rey says, you didn't fail Kylo, Kylo failed you. I won't. And having Luke sit down in that space with the symbol and the water out from, that was inside from where Rey was meditating on the rock, and talk about the Jedi and talk about how, the Jedi at the height of their power allowed Darth Sidious to create the Empire and to destroy them, right? A Jedi master trained Darth Vader, and she was right to go and throw it back in his face, and we'll go, well, yeah, and you brought him back. And I was always expecting that to happen, but I really do like the way they handled that, because they could have very easily, which I wouldn't have been okay with, but I think a lot of people would have had a hard time with, and maybe wouldn't have been fair. But he could have spent a lot of time talking about how wrong the Jedi were. And I talked about that in shows. A Jedi shall not know anger, no hate, nor love, right? This thing. And he didn't do that. He didn't go so far as to say what the Jedi did were wrong. He just basically said the Jedi were misguided. The Force isn't something that just a Jedi has. It's something that everybody can have. You just need to be able to go and reach out and to tap into it. And some people are stronger in it than others are. And so I thought they really handled that well. It gave me, this fan, what I wanted in the acknowledgement of what the Jedi did and why Luke was the way that he was. And when you come full circle and get to the end of the movie, though, what I find fascinating is that they didn't abandon the Jedi ways. Everything, when he looks and says it for the second time, but this time, first time saying it to Rey, but this time saying it to Kylo at the end of the movie, everything you just said was wrong. When I die, I'm not going to be the last of the Jedi. And then we end up seeing Rey. It was like Lucasfilm, Rian Johnson and Disney and Lucasfilm were all saying, hey, look, we're all going someplace different. And we are reestablishing what the Force is, but we're also opening this up. So, where I thought we were getting to a place where the Jedi would be no more, and maybe there would be no more Sith, that might be, but it also seems like we are heading into a place where both can exist. You can now not just have light side, dark side, Sith, Jedi, but you can have a Sith, and you can have a Jedi, and you can have the Knights of Ren, and you can have somebody who is simply just strong in the Force but isn't trained in the Jedi ways, but yet could be potentially just as powerful. And that really makes the most sense and opens up the world even more so than it already was, and gives us a lot more avenues to go. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I knew this was going to happen. I'm going to keep the podcast short today only because I'm really short on time to the standard 45 minutes. I will have another episode next week where we'll continue this discussion because we have plenty of times to continue this discussion, and I'm sure I'll see the movie a couple times before I do the next episode. But I want to spend the last 5 minutes just talking about Rey and Kylo. Because that dynamic between them and those moments where, as somebody else said on another show, and I think it was Perry Nemiroff on Collider, where the air is sucked out of the room. The sound is sucked out, and all you hear is Kylo Ren and Rey speaking in those moments back and forth, where we know that Snoke was allowing that to happen. And I'm of the opinion that Snoke was allowing them to make the connection and was putting them in a position to make the connection because Kylo says, "Are you doing this?" And then follows that up and says, "No, if you were doing this, it would kill you." Which explains why Luke ended up dying in the end, having to force project himself for as long as he did. But to me, it was all just about Snoke making the mistake of thinking that what he was doing was putting Rey in a position and Kylo in a position where he would get Kylo to bring Luke to him, but he got Rey instead, and he thought he was going to be able to benefit from it, and he didn't, because Rey and Kylo's connection was way too strong. Those scenes were just spectacular, and the way that Rian Johnson handled every single one of those moments prior to her getting on the supremacy in what is my favorite moment, favorite play out of a scene in all of Star Wars, of all of that, the moment that Rey, Kylo, and Snoke are in his chamber together, all of that. All the way through the battle to the Praetorian Guard to where Holdo goes into light speed and slices through the supremacy is my favorite sequence in any Star Wars movie. Just absolutely spectacular. But right before she gets to that point, I bought into the fact that these two were drawn together and that something was happening with them. You know, is it romantic? Don't know. There obviously is a connection there. And at this point, it doesn't even need to be romantic. There's just a personal connection. They need each other. They say as much. And I thought it was a really, really interesting choice by Rian Johnson, and a good one that Rian Johnson puts a lot of sex in his movies, for those that have seen him, either implied or directly. I mean, there was a sex scene in Looper, and I'm not a fan of those, but I'm going to make a bigger point here. He has a lot of sensuality in his movies. Oh, same thing in there's actually a couple of different moments in Looper where there's a lot of sensuality and sex. And even in Brothers Bloom, there's some implied sex there. I liked the fact that if you're going to look at a moment that was romantic in any way, shape, or form, he kind of turned the tables on what we normally see. And instead of seeing a topless woman there, he decided to go with Rey seeing Kylo half undressed and how uncomfortable that made her. And it's a dynamic we don't see very often in movies. And I'm not going to go so far as to say it was progressive. I just thought it was a very good story choice to make that connection where she's kind of embarrassed. And he's actually embarrassed too. He's, I don't want to do this now. And he's kind of like, I don't want to either, probably because he's in a half state of undress. So I just thought that was a very unique choice, and it absolutely worked. And it was very much like Rian Johnson, because obviously he can't put that much sensuality in a film. That was about as close as he was going to get. And it worked for me. And we'll get into and start off next week's podcast talking about that entire sequence of Snoke and Rey and Kylo in the chamber and the choices that are made. But that was just some of the most amazing filmmaking I have ever seen. That whole battle from the moment that Kylo kills Snoke and the lightsaber ignited, flies over, and Rey grabs it, and they both stand up together, and it goes into slow motion of the two of them getting ready to square off against the Praetorian Guards, and it happens there in slow motion, and then it kicks into regular time. That battle was just sheer magic and makes the entire movie for me. And we're not even, we still got a whole rest of the film to go, because the stuff on Crate I absolutely loved. I thought that was just fantastic. Thank you so much for checking out the show. I will be back again next week, and we'll just continue this discussion of this amazing movie. Such a great time to be a Star Wars fan. Drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Spreaker, Stitcher, Podbean, iTunes, and of course YouTube. Drop me a comment on YouTube. A lot of you guys do, and I really do appreciate it. Have yourself a fantastic week as we head into the Christmas week, and I'll talk to you again next week. Until then, may the Force be with you always.
My nerd